and get started. So welcome to the second small ruminant webinar of 2023. If you have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we will get to them as we go through the program. I am Carolyn Ihde, the Ag Educator for Crawford and Richland counties. Lissa Seafelt, the Ag Educator in Eau Claire County. Bernie O'Rourke, the Youth Livestock Extension Specialist, and Todd Taylor, the Arlington Sheep Unit Program Manager, also assist with our webinar series. Please feel free to reach out to us in the chat or by email if you have any questions or comments. And just in case some of you are not familiar with Zoom, please remember the most important Zoom functions, your microphone and the video that are located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen, and also the chat box, which is located at the bottom middle of your screen. Please leave your microphones muted during the webinar, and there will be time at the end of the presentation to ask questions. And also, please ensure that your video is off, and that will help with everyone's bandwidth. Please place any questions or comments in the chat box, and we will be monitoring those as we go along. And Lissa will be asking us those questions if we have some. So right now we'll go ahead and collect our producer poll that just lets us know a little bit about who's in the room with us and helps us gather information for future programming. So please take a moment to complete that. Looking great. We have a lot of different types of producers here, some sheep and goats producers on with us tonight. Take another 10 seconds or so and we can end our poll. Thank you for participating.
Okay, well, tonight we're going to be hearing from Carolyn Ihde and Bill Halfman. Carolyn Ihde is the agriculture educator in Crawford and Richland counties. And we have Bill Halfman, who is the beef outreach specialist. Prior to this role, he was actually a county-based educator as well. So he was helping work with Carolyn on this tool development prior to taking on this new role. So that's why we've got him here with us tonight. We've got the two experts for the sheep enterprise budget. So with that, I'm going to turn the floor back over to Carolyn.
Great. Thank you, Lissa, and it's great to be able to be with you guys tonight and present this information. Like Lissa said, Bill is here with us tonight. Bill and several other extension colleagues created a beef enterprise budget several years ago, and when I began with extension, I asked him if he thought that we could convert that into a sheep budget, and he said yes, that we could. And so we worked together on that and converted it into a sheep enterprise budget, and that's what you're going to see tonight. During the webinar, we're going to walk you through the budget tool and can demonstrate how you can create one that is customizable for your own operation. And then once you have created your own budget, you can take that information and make some informed decisions. But before we get right to the enterprise budget, I do have some data that I want to share with you. So in January, I had a chance to attend the American Sheep Industry Annual Convention. And there I heard a talk from Dr. David Anderson from Texas A&M. And he shared the following slides, and I have to say I'm not an economist, so I'm just kind of sharing the slides that he shared with us at their so that you have the same information. So in 2021, we saw high lamb prices and they held into the spring of 2022. And many variables came into play for the drop in prices that we saw in the summer and fall of 22. And we'll continue to see the prices lower than they have been the past year or so. And we're just going to simplify them into the variables of supply and demand, competition with low price imports, frozen lamb supplies, and lesser or higher dressing weights. And we can also look at the slaughter lamb prices and see the same fall in the prices. And then we can also look at a couple other things on the data side, the per capita disposable income and personal savings account. And this will lend us to believe that folks, when they go to the grocery store, they'll be looking for those lower price protein sources. So what are we going to do about this in the upcoming year? There's a few things we can do to reduce costs that we are seeing. We can use this information to make decisions. So what can we do? We can look at how we are storing and feeding our feeds, because those are the most expensive inputs that we have. So I have a chart here and a great picture showing the way that most of us store our hay outside unprotected. And then we see in the chart that we are incurring great deals of losses when we store our hay outside without any cover. Bill, do you have anything to add to this slide? Because I know that you do a lot of research.
Yeah, this was work done at Tennessee, and you can see the various amounts of waste. Of course, a couple of things that come into play is how long the hay is stored for, because the longer it's stored, the greater the loss. There's also been some questions about bale wrapping and bale sleeves, and the research that we were able to find from some other sources suggested that wrapping the bales and using the sleeves, as long as it's not in a wet location on the ground, should have similar losses to storing the hay in a shed. Of course, we have to look at and compare our costs of the shed versus a wrap and things like that. And one you build once and the other one you have to pay for every year. So those are things you want to consider. But it's a good idea if we're not doing anything to help protect our hay. There's opportunities there to save some money or sell some excess hay.
Very good, thank you. And then we could also look at another aspect when we feed our sheep and goats at the feeders. How are they actually eating? And we know that sheep and goats like to sort through their hay and like to just get the finest leaves, and therefore they do tend to waste that way. So there's different types of hay feeders out there, but due to availability and shipping of those, sometimes the best feeder may not be accessible to us. So just take a chance and look around and see which kind of hay feeders would be best in your operation, and see if you're able to get those. Excuse me. And because feed is one of those largest prices that we have for our inputs, do you know the nutritional value of our feed stuff? So another tool that we can use is we can do forage testing, so that we're able to match the forage that we have with the production cycle or the production stage that our animals are in. So we're not overfeeding nutrients when our sheep's nutritional needs are lower. And then this will help us not have to put high price grain concentrate. And then also, can we graze our sheep longer? Look at our grazing system and wonder if we can graze some other things like cover crops or corn stalks and the like. Another method we could do to help save input costs is to sort our ewes, sort the ewes into young stock or older stock, maybe into early pregnancy, later gestation, early lactation, and later lactation, and then use those testing from our forages to match our needs. And then also we can keep records to make it more informed decisions about mothering ability, lambs weaned, weight of the lambs weaned, and then we can call those non-productive or less productive ewes. Another thing we can do is we can use technologies and tools to improve genetics and record keeping to improve flock productivity. We can belong to NSIP, which is the National Sheep Improvement Program, So look at the genetics that we have in our flock and how they compare to others. And when we're buying new breeding stock, we can make our informed decision. Electronic identification, so that we have our animals identified to those higher producers and lower producers. And then have some marketing strategies. Do we have a relationship with our local auction barn where we're taking our animals so that they know your animals are coming and they can let the buyers know? So those are just some tips and tricks that you can do. And Bill has one more for us.
Yeah, we'd be remiss to not talk a little bit about stockmanship and the importance of low stress animal handling. There's a lot of research that's been done with different species of livestock, including sheep, that show that implementation of low stress handling practices with facilities that function well do result in improved animal performance and lower stress levels by the animals. And so that would include both our behavior when we're working with the sheep. Our behavior speaks volumes. In addition, looking at your facilities, making sure that they're designed to have good flow, looking for places where there might be problems with shadows or corners where they seem to pile up in, or different things like that, that we can do some things, generally low cost things, to eliminate some of these problems. Then also the use of dogs, and then certainly livestock herding dogs are very helpful with working with sheep, but we want to make sure that both the sheep and the dogs are acclimated to each other, and that the dogs that we have are efficient but not overly aggressive to cause additional problems and stress for the animals.
Thank you, Bill. And then moving forward, so now we're going to move into the enterprise budget, where we can take a look at our financial picture of our operations and see if we can make some adjustments there. So what you're seeing right now is a picture of our livestock website. We also may call it the topic hub. So if you hear us referring to it as our topic hub, just know that that's our web page. And the enterprise budget is housed on our website, and I'm going to show you how to access that and where to go to get that tool. So there's two different places you can visit when you come to our page, and one is located here where it says decision tools and software, and then another section would be here where it says topics, and there will be a drop down bar. What I'm going to click on now is actually a live link that I have in my slideshow, and that will take us to the livestock topic hub. Maybe. Sorry about that. Just 1 second. Always works in practice, doesn't it? There we go. Okay, so now you're looking at the livestock topic hub, and I'm going to go to the decision tools. With a very slow internet connection, I guess, tonight. And once you're on the decision tools and software page, you will locate the worksheets. And when you click this, we'll open up to a lot of different tools that we have that you can look at if you have a beef operation, but we're going to scroll down to the bottom, and we'll actually reference a few of these tools later on in a presentation that you could adjust for sheep operation. But located here is the sheep operation enterprise budget. And when I click on that, it's going to download it, and it depends on what browser you're using and what you have your computer to set up to where the downloads go. That's going to be where your downloads. But when I click on the enterprise budget, it is now downloading from the internet a copy that will be my own right now. And so when you download it, it will be your very own budget tool. And the first thing that we'll have to do is click on this enable editing, because it wants you to be aware of files that you are getting from the internet. So I'll click on that, and that will let us be able to work in the decision tool. So the decision tool is an Excel spreadsheet, and we'll walk through that today. Bill was one of the creators of this, so he knows the ins and outs of this spreadsheet tool, and I just kind of assisted him and said yes, but that makes sense for sheep. So we will walk through that, and hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. So on the bottom, you'll notice there are different colored tabs, and those are the different Excel the sheets that you have. So one, we have a flock budget for your entire U flock. We have a dry lot lamb finishing budget. And then also, if you click on these three buttons here, it'll give us a few more to look at. And there's a pasture lamb finishing budget right here. But before we get to that, we're going to go back to the beginning, and Bill's going to discuss some of the directions and the way that this works.
Yeah, so the way we set this up is each one of the different budgets has one of the tabs in the spreadsheet has a set of directions, instructions, and they're basically written in order that you would go through the spreadsheet tool. We tried to have a lot of helpful hints in these to help you know what needs to go into those different sections. When we built our different spreadsheet tools for the different species, our goal is to be as straightforward and user-friendly as possible, try to make them as intuitive as possible, and asking you to enter in the numbers that should be reasonably easy for you to come up with, and let the spreadsheet tool do most of the math for you as you walk through these. So you'll find a direction sheet that you can move back and forth between the tabs, and then also throughout the different spreadsheet enterprise budget tools themselves, you'll find different boxes. I think some of them in this one are green and maybe some yellow that are also directions with some helpful hints within the spreadsheets themselves. Again, it's intended to be practical and applied for the users and make it easier for them to do things with. These other thing to keep in mind is these are estimates, and the numbers that you get out of it at the end are only as good as the information you plug in up front.
That's right, Bill. So like this is the direction tab, and are you ready to go to the U flock budget?
Sure, let's move through.
All right, so then we'll click on the U flock budget tab, and it will show us what we have for the budget. Are you able to see that? Okay. Just let me adjust it a little bit here. Am I made it too big? I'm just trying to get the screen large enough so everyone can see it if you're on a smaller device. I think that's where it's going to play nice for me today. So if you'll see lots of different colors on this sheet, and all the colors represent something. So like Bill said before, anything that's in a green box is kind of a little note for you, or directions to help you think about what goes in each section. The blue tabs, or the blue cells, excuse me, the blue cells are anywhere that a user can enter data. And so like Bill said before, this tool is only as good as the data that you enter in. So we have in here right now, when you open it, just some examples of what you would put in there, just to help you be able to see what could go into the budget. So for this example, we had 45 U's beginning this budget cycle. And this budget is divided into a couple of different sections, and the first one is the revenue. So the ways that you will have money coming into your operation. So whether that be through the sale of feeder lambs, tall ewes and rams, wool, and then other livestock. So when we're building a budget, we like to think that the lambs will move from the U flock budget to their own finishing budget if you were to feeding them out at about time of weaning. And then they will be excess of value of what you could have sold them for. And I'm just going to show you how you would change this data for your own use. You would click in the cell, delete what's currently in there, and then you can title the groups to however matches your operation. So maybe these were my fall lambs, something like that similar. And so you'll want to make sure you put in the number of head, their weight, and then that price that either you actually did sell them for, or that they would be the value of them when you move them into your finishing budget. Did I miss anything there, Bill?
Nope, that was a good description.
Thank you.
So then our next section, we get into some of the expenses, and we start out with the direct expenses. And We have start out with homegrown feed. And again, this we try to be flexible with these. So you are certainly welcome to describe your different feed sources however you want. Change them to what matches up your, how you identify them. Again, we're looking at the feed stuff, the quantity used, and we have flexibility in the way you want to use for units. I know when working with farmers, some know the quantity of feed in tons, other ones know how many big round bales they use or whatever, and you can apply that however you want. It's the most important part is to make sure that you apply a value that's appropriate for that unit that you use. And we typically recommend when doing these with homegrown feed to use the value for that homegrown feed that you could sell it for. Some folks would go ahead and figure out what's their cost to produce it and want to use that. And if you do that, then what you're doing is assuming that your crop enterprise has zero potential for profit. So the general rule of thumb we have is market value is kind of what we might use as an opportunity cost for that homegrown feed. If we want to slide down a little more, we also have then purchase feed. And again, as you can see here, we're using some units that the producer might be more familiar with. Again, it's flexible for you to use what you want. A lot of folks don't know how many 50-pound bags they buy and what they pay for a bag. And so that's the way we use the examples here, but it could be tons or whatever makes sense for you with your record keeping system. So we would enter that in the total feed usage for the production cycle. Typically, we're looking at a year kind of a situation.
And then Bill, I forgot to mention that the other colors on the sheet are yellow, and that's going to calculate in the total cost. And that our blue columns you can see as a per U cost, and or it's not expense but income, and then on the per lamb side. So I forgot to mention this. And then moving down, we also have a section for bedding, and like always, you can change the blue cells to match whatever material you use for bedding, quantity in units and value, and you see how they are allocated this way.
And then moving along, we have our veterinary medicine breeding costs section. This one we may not have all the expenses that a typical flock may incur. We have some examples, and of course, you may have some additional things that you would need to enter in for yours. And so that would be where you would put that. And it's typically it would encourage some itemization so you can kind of go back and look at and see where the greater costs and the lower costs are, and evaluate those. Can we do a little better or not for those individual areas where you would incur those expenses.
Then moving on to the next section is pasture expenses, and you can see in here we have seed, fertilizer, lime, herbicide, and those we don't usually normally incur those expenses every year, so we have to manually allocate those over a 4-year period or however long that input is going to last in your pasture. So
Yep.
Those costs are spread over the amount of time that they are being used.
Right. In this case, what we're looking at is then there may be a little pencil and calculator work on this, but any of those things like seeding or herbicide that you don't do every year, you'd want to prorate that out over the number of years. That's important to make sure your costs are representative for that particular year.
And then any pasture rents or fence repair, and this fence repair would be those annual fence repairs that you make. Maybe you buy a few new strands of electric netting to do some rotational grazing, or you fix a couple of things. This would not be putting in a new fence. We'll talk about putting in a total new fence later in another section. Moving on to some other direct expenses, and you see here that the cells are in white, and so these are permanently in the spreadsheet. There's no changing them. But if you do not have those types of expenses, you would just leave them blank as you see here. And there are 4 lines to add any additional other direct expenses that you may incur.
So then our next section, we have a summary of all of our direct expenses with the total. And then we also have an opportunity cost for those. And what that means is if we were not raising sheep, we could take all the money from those potential expenses. So the money from the sale of any homegrown feed, the money that we wouldn't spend on purchase feed and those things, potentially put it in a savings account or some sort or another in the bank and earn some interest on it. And so that's basically what we call the opportunity cost of those expenses. And you can plug whatever interest rates you want to use in on that to kind of look at your opportunity cost for those. And that comes into play when we're looking at enterprise budget, cost of production and those kinds of things.
So our next section are the overhead costs, and those are the costs that are going to last longer than a year or so. And we have a section here for our home raised ewes. And we do have a little error here. We apologize for that. So each ewe should be entered on the line below, and only enter in the home raised ewes into this section. So this section will assign a value of what you think you could sell those ewes for, kind of their value on this annual production cycle. And knowing that our younger ewes are typically more valuable than our older ewes.
Yep, and what this is used for is to actually, when we look at home raised breeding animals, what we're looking at is finding an opportunity cost for the value of those. That's the only thing we're doing with those for this purpose. So that helps to calculate that.
Then our next section would be any purchased breeding stock that we brought in. Typically, those are our rams and maybe some new breeding ewes. And then we'll put in the years bought, the purchase price, and then the years you intend to keep them. And then a call value here, and then that will prorate the cost over that time that you have them.
And now we move into the machinery, equipment, building, and those kinds of things, expenses. And this is not using the IRS depreciation schedule to minimize your tax obligations to the government. This is we approach this more from a capital recovery standpoint of spreading out the cost over the useful life of the machine, because we know a lot of equipment will last longer than what the depreciation schedule would have it zeroed out at. So as you can see, the simplest way we can do this, to again, try to keep it practical, is we list our equipment and we list kind of what's a value for it. You know, what would it cost us to buy one just like it now? And then how many years do we intend to keep it? And what do we estimate we would probably get for it at the time for a trade-in? Again, these are estimates and we can get reasonably close, but recognize it's not perfect. So that's going to come up with an annual expense for us from prorating that out over that life. And then this one, we start adding some things in here. We know that some of this equipment probably is going to be used for things more than just the ewe flock. And so what we need to do there is get a reasonable estimate of what % of its annual use is for the ewe flock. Like for instance, the manure spreader, we have a 50%. So maybe they have some hogs or some cattle or something on the farm too. And roughly half the manure hauls from the sheep and the other half is from the other species. And so that's how that's kind of estimated. And then it prorates that out to what % of that expenses should be paid for by the ewe flock. We've got a 1-ton dually and a gooseneck trailer and some things like that. And maybe they do some custom hauling, or maybe they haul cattle first, or who knows what, so that's kind of how that section is set up. And you can add in or delete out, whatever you use on your farm into this section.
And this is also another way to maybe look at those assets that you own, and maybe they're only used once a year. Maybe you can partner with somebody else to have that same bit of equipment to reduce the cost or your expenses in your operation.
Right. Well, one thing you will notice in this is there's no crop No balers, no hay mowers, no corn planters, no combines. Because what we're recommending is this is just the equipment used for the routine care of the flock. The crop equipment should actually be used in the crop enterprise budget, which, by the way, UW Extension does have one of those. And then we look at, assigning that opportunity cost to the homegrown crops. So that's why that you don't see those here. Is this is solely looking at the enterprise, and those crop enterprises would be considered their own separate entities.
And as you can see, we have lots of lines for you to fill in anything else or additional that you may have in this machinery and equipment section. Moving on to the next section, we all house and take care of sheep in different ways. So these are just some examples of what you may have for facilities. Maybe you have a hay shed, winter shed, a machine shed, and these two, you put a current value in, years of useful life, it'll calculate the depreciation expense, and then you also to allocate that to the amount that the sheep flock actually will use.
Yep, and we fully realize that figuring out some kind of a value for older buildings is very difficult. We don't have a perfect method to do that. I think the most important thing is to put some sort of a reasonable value in for those. And I think we have some discussion maybe in the directions on considerations for that, but we realize that's tough. It's easy if it's a brand new one because you know what you wrote the check out for, but older ones, it's tough, and we recognize that.
And then moving on to other overhead expenses that would be, real estate and property taxes and farm insurance. And again, you can calculate it based on the percent that needs to be allocated to the youth block.
And so we mentioned fences earlier. And what about permanent fences, or what about buying some polynet that might have a 5 or 6 year useful life? Those, if we back up under the buildings and machinery and those kinds of area, that would maybe be where we would put the cost if we recently built a permanent fence. We'd put the cost that we had to build that, and then we could put the years of useful life, and that would sort of prorate the expense of those fence items out over their useful life. The poly fence and the temporary things and the fencers, that maybe would just be another line under the machinery section. And again, kind of looking at what we paid for it and a useful life to get a reasonable prorating it out.
So can I pause you for a second? We had a question that came in that's probably relevant to this section. There was a question about, does the spreadsheet have livestock depreciation included? Can you talk just a little bit about that quickly?
So the way that we addressed that was the way we assigned the different values to the different ages of the lambs. The depreciation on the purchased livestock, that's shown in the spreading it out over the years of useful life. But we worked with Dr. Botel and Dr. Bernhard at Platteville and River Falls, and the way we kind of figured out the easiest, simplest way for livestock depreciation is the way it is there, because of the way you account for it. Home raised animals, to just look at that opportunity cost and prorate their values out over there, the way it is set up there.
Lisa, do you have any other questions?
Yep, there was one other one that had just come in. You had mentioned the kind of temporary fences that have a useful life of 5 or 6 years. What about, how do you deal with the useful life of a permanent fence?
Oh, that's a good question. And what I would do is Iowa State University, and I think it's the University of Kentucky and or Tennessee, have some really nice publications on fencing. And they also have some charts in there that shows the estimated useful life of the different styles of fence that you can build. And so that we know that some of the fence styles have a shorter useful life or a longer one, depending on the materials they're made out of. And there's a nice chart in those publications that does give you that kind of information. So that would be what I would recommend, folks. And if you can't find it, shoot one of the folks an email here and we'll dig it up for you.
Yep. Thank you for those questions. Moving to where we left off, we talked about this. So we were at our opportunity cost on owned pasture. And here you'd enter in the number of acres that you have your sheep on. Enter in a value per acre and the interest rate on that for the opportunity cost, and that's what you could also be using your land for.
And so then our next section is basically a summary of everything above. And so we've kind of got a summary of our income. And then we get into kind of the summary, the bottom line for the different direct expense sections. And then then we start looking at some of our math questions, return over direct expenses. That's one of the things we look at when we do budgeting. And you can see here that we've got some numbers there. Then we look down, slide down a little more. Overhead expenses is our summary. Again, the kind of the bottom line for each of those sections. And then our total. And then we get into the next section is our income over feed costs, or revenue over feed costs, which is a very typical type of a ratio or numbers that we look at in livestock enterprises. And why that is because feed is usually one of the largest expenses in livestock enterprises. And so that's a pretty typical one that's looked at. And you can see what, again, this is in our example, what those look like. Plugging in your own numbers is much more valuable. So.
Hey, Bill, can I ask you a question? Because I think
Sure.
you might have the answer on this one. We had a question in the chat. Could you just explain a little bit more about what opportunity cost is referring to, what that means?
Yeah, so it basically what it is if I use this set of assets that have a value for this enterprise, that means I'm tying up the money, the value of those assets in this enterprise. And if I were to not be doing this enterprise, I could put that money to work doing something else. And so for some of our examples, what we're saying, what the most common one is, if I wasn't using all the feed and the vaccines and the bedding and those things for raising sheep, one example that I could do is I could put it in the bank and I could earn interest on it, so I could get some return on it. Now, we all know interest rates are terrible now, so it's not going to be a lot, but it is something to be recognized. Like with the feed, like with the homegrown feed, when we talk about, use an opportunity cost price for it, it's basically what could I sell that feed for rather than feed it to the sheep. So it's kind of what's an alternative use that we could value that at. Another way to look at the pasture opportunity cost could be, well, if I don't put sheep out there, I could rent it to somebody else for so much, and they could put livestock out there. So. Then we have we've got another question about labor and all those things. And if you go up into the other, we have a whole bunch of lines up above for other expenses, and those can all be entered up into that section. So there is places for them. Up a little higher.
Okay, I was like, you wanted to go.
Yeah.
Oh, in here, Commissioner Recall.
Up.
Sorry.
Yeah, so here we've got paid labor, hired labor, those kinds of things. And then we have blue lines down below, we've got permits, we've got advertising. So there are places that those costs can be entered into the tool.
Okay, moving back down. Sorry if I'm scrolling too fast for anybody.
And then Bill, I don't know if you saw there was another question that came through the chat. What was the 1% interest rate in the opportunity cost of land?
Well, for these, we just kind of used some sort of an estimate on what we might get for interest at the bank. So it's really up to you guys, users, to kind of plug in what they feel like is a reasonable interest rate for a return.
Okay, and then one more question and we'll let you keep going. Is there an optimal revenue over feed cost that we should be kind of looking out for? Or is, something like that more internal reference for ourselves?
It is an internal reference for the most part at this point in time. We do know it's going to vary from year to year when feed costs are high and maybe lamb prices aren't quite so high. It's not going to be as nice as other years. Right now, that I know there's been some interest in efforts to try to collect some small flock farm performance data, which then would potentially provide some, comparisons to use it against. So, because I know Carolyn was visiting with some folks from some other states about trying to see if that's a possibility.
So I think we talk about this as a budget. This is moving forward, looking forward to what we could expect our cost and income to be on this group of sheep. But after you do this a while, you'll get your own historical data that you can use to put this in. So sometimes, like, I keep a lot of my records on chicken scratch on a piece of paper, but this is just another way for you to keep those numbers. And after a few years of keeping the numbers in the spreadsheet, you'll be able to see trends in the way that your operation is working.
Right. And so then we kind of get down into our returns and our break evens. And we do this two different methods. One, we use the enterprise budget, and this one is actually a truer measure of profitability. And kind of getting back to some of those labor and things, this is kind of where we look at our returns to our unpaid labor and management for the sheep enterprise budget. But if we look at this in the enterprise budget method, we do include all the annual overhead costs, cash expenses, opportunity costs, but it does not include intermediate and long-term debt principal payments, because that expense is actually addressed from the depreciation of the overhead items. And so if we were to include both in this method, we'd actually be double counting, and we don't want to do that. So when we talk to the ag economists, that's the way they're covered in enterprise budget. And you can see here that our return to unpaid labor and management in our example, again, this is an example and it's not perfect, doesn't look very good for this particular example. And hopefully, you'll plug in your own numbers and yours will look much better than that. It does calculate a break even. That does include all revenue. That would mean the coal sales, the wool sales, and any of those kinds of things as well. And then the last line there actually assumes that the coal and the wool sales and things would, are what they are. And then that shows you what you would actually, the sale price for the lambs themselves would be. And then we do have a sensitivity analysis table that compares feed cost and that break-even lamb sale price to look at how does that help things if lamb prices go up and or down, and then feed prices go up or down to kind of see what that looks like. And then we also have a cash flow method of looking at things. And if we look at this carefully, this just includes cash expenses, cost of the homegrown feed, taxes, insurance, principal, and interest payments. And you can see that here is where we would ask for any principal and interest payments, and what percent of those we expect the ewe flock to cover. And so this does not include any overhead cost of buildings and equipment or any of the opportunity costs. So this would be kind of, on some years, are we at least making enough money to write checks for all the bills we got to pay? You can't use this long term because it doesn't take into account your overhead items, and eventually they'll wear out, and you got to replace those. So this is not a true measure of profitability, but it does help us to, on bad years, are we at least making enough money to write all the checks we have to write? And another sensitivity analysis table.
Are we caught up on questions before we move on?
We just had a question or something got dropped in the chat. Since you have developed an economic model, why don't you run it on a national basis and see what the impact to US growers is relative to the imports we get in this country from Australia and all the other places that we import lambs into our market from. I would suggest, especially this last year, our growers took a deep dive based on imports from the US imported this last year. So I guess the question is getting at, would this be something that could be translated to a national scale?
I would think so. It's got, I mean, just.
Isn't that kind of what WIC was looking to try to do?
Yeah, we were looking at trying to find the cost of production across the producers in the US, but we haven't gotten that one going.
I believe there's some ag economists that are trying to make something like that happen.
Right. So it might take a while yet. So maybe in the works for the future. Hold on yet.
Exactly. Okay. So that is the part where we keep track of our ewe flock as it is from one breeding and weaning season to another. And then when we'll move our lambs over to a finishing budget, if you sell your lambs at weaning or right after weaning, then you won't need to use the dry lot finishing directions or finishing budget. But if you would like to know whether I should feed them out or should I sell them when I'm done at weaning, this is a tool that you can use. And then you can also use it to see where you can make changes. And as before, there was the dry lot finishing directions in this aqua tab. And then we'll have the dry lot finishing budget in the white tab. But the finishing budgets have two sheets with them because of the way the spreadsheet works. And we will go through that, but we will have the finishing feed cost in the budget tab here. So if I go ahead and open the dry lot lamb finishing budget. And let's go to the top. Sorry, I'm having difficulties with my ability to make it large on your screen. Okay. And just as before, the blue cells are for the user to enter in their own data. This one is a little bit different than the UFlock budget sheet. We'll have to enter in some information and then it will project what we're going to have. We'll start with the projected sale date and you'll enter that into this cell. The sell weight of your lambs, what you expect to sell them at. The sale price, and I'm going to go ahead and change this a little bit because I did have some information to thinking that might be more around $1.70 a pound when we finish our lambs. And then you will also want to put in the day that you have moved them from the youth budget or the day that you have purchased them. And then that weight there. And that price could be around $2.10 for the spring for feeder lambs. Just some numbers that we have. I wanted to change that so it's a more realistic demonstration of what we could have. And then you'll also put in the number that you started. Okay. And then Bill's going to talk about the performance data that it will get calculated from the information you put on the dry lot finishing feed cost.
Yeah, so basically once you, and this spreadsheet is actually better for kind of looking at making a projection on what do we think it's going to be if we feed them out. We've got a closeout spreadsheet tool for finishing. Well, right now it's set up with finishing out a pen of steers example in it, but you could use it just the way it is for doing lambs if it don't offend you to see steer or cattle in there every once in a while. And Carolyn and I will probably take it and cleanse those cattle words out of there, replace it with lamb, and maybe make a few other adjustments to it be more sheep specific, but it would work just fine. And if we have time, we can certainly show you that, to take all your information from a group you did finish and look at how that panned out. So this one's kind of a, should I keep them or should I sell them, kind of a decision tool. Once we kind of plug in our, our beginning weight, our end weights, our estimated sale dates and some values for them, it's going to do some of these performance calculations. It's going to get an estimated weight gain, days on feed, your rate of gain. Your feed to gain will show up once you enter in the feed information from the other tab. And same with the feed costs. Those are going to automatically populate on here from the feed tab. The reason why we have a feed tab separate from this sheet is the columns just don't match up and look civil at all when we have the way it's set up on this sheet, and then try to shove the feed costs in on this same sheet. It would be some seriously ugly looking spreadsheet. So we separated them out to make them look cleaner to use.
So if I go there to the feed cost tab, you'll open that up, and here's where you can enter in the types of feed that you have. And then you'll use this to calculate that. But if Bill, if you want to go over that a little bit more.
So basically what we're doing here is you need to kind of work on your ration, know what your ration is, plug in your average pounds of feed fed per day of the different ingredients and an as fed basis, and then the dry matter percent. And if you look at the third yellow column to the going across, you can compare that to the total pounds as fed needed if you know how many pounds of feed it typically takes you to finish out a lamb, to make sure you're close on that, to any fine tuning on that. And once you have this information in, again, it's looking at an average over this feeding period. It's going to calculate out some of those performance indicators and some of those costs. And we need to, you need to enter in some prices on your feeds to help with some of those prices on feeds. You go down to the below there, and we've got some converters to help you convert some things from, maybe you know what the price per bag is, but not the price per ton. So you can plug those numbers in and it'll calculate that for you. Same with if we know if for some other grains, for instance, I think up above on corn, we've got it on a bushel basis, but for the other grains, if you're using some of those, plug in the price per bushel, and then we've got the green box with the different bushel weights for the other grains that might be used in some lamb feeding some rations to enter in those feed costs.
So once you complete the data on this page, it will send it back to the dry lot finishing budget.
Yep. And then our feed costs per head and per pound to gain, and our total feed costs show up, and so does our feed to gain in the block above. And then it will also give us the total feed cost for the number of lambs we're looking to feed out.
And so as in the U budget, we had a place for veterinarian, pharmaceutical, and health costs. This one's a little bit different than the U block one. This was, you'll enter the item here, and then you'll enter it as a group cost, because it's probably something that you're going to be doing on a group basis rather than an individual basis. And then the spreadsheet will back calculate that to what it costs on a per head basis.
Yep. So for instance, most of the time, if we're buying vaccines, we know we got to buy so many boxes or bottles, and we know what that cost is that'll take to take care of the flock. And then we move down and we've got some other expenses there. Death loss, we just plug in a percent. We've got some interest costs that you can plug in, what your operating loan might be. If you're not, if you're borrowing the money, if you're not borrowing the money, that same amount of money in a savings account, what would be the interest rate that it earns? And then we've got a list of other expenses, bedding, shearing. Somebody was asking about the commission and checkoff. There's a marketing cost line for that you could enter those costs into for that. And so and most of those, I think most folks are probably gonna know what the total was for the group more so than individual, at least from the folks that we bounced this off of when we put it together. They suggested it would be easier to do it that way, so that's why it's set up the way it is. And then we've got yardage.
So yardage is that fee, and not fee, but the price that it takes you to take care of the animals, not your labor, but the electricity, housing, going out there and the wear and tear on some of your equipment. And we do have a yardage calculator for on the cattle side, and you're more than free to go use that one and to see what it has for yardage costs.
Right, yardage is a mix of overhead costs and some of the direct expenses like fuel and oil and utilities and but the number that we have in there was one that we found from some of the budgeting from Nebraska, but ideally folks need to calculate their own because everybody's is going to be different.
And then it'll figure the cost per pound of gain, and this will be the pounds that the animal gained once it was in the feeding system. So not the weight that it started with, so just the amount on the cost per gain of the pounds that were actually gained. So if we started with a 50-pound lamb and it ends at 150 pounds, then that would be for the 100 pounds.
And so then we get into our summary, looking at our estimated receipts and then our variable expenses. And that's going to be our, subtract those two from each other. That's the return to labor management and capital. The fixed expenses, the yardage is kind of our more or less our capital type of cost. And then we subtract that off, and that's our returns to our unpaid labor and management that we have there. In this example, you can see what that is, and then it calculates out some break evens. And we've also got a sensitivity analysis on this, the same kind of a thing, looking at the sale price versus the feed cost per pound of lamb sold. And how does that change the profit or loss?
So remember that when you download it, there's information in the blue boxes, but that's just the example, and you'll want to make sure all the example data is out so that it's only calculating the information for your enterprise. Okay, I see that there is a question about the death loss cost, so I'm going to go back up to that, Bill, if you want to.
Yeah, if you go down to where the death loss is,
Yeah, there we
and
go.
put the cursor on that yellow box with the 1275. Okay. 11 and 12. So if we go up to 11 and 12, what it's doing is it's taking our income and then just taking 5% of that as our because we have a 5% death loss, and so it's just taking, we're losing 5% of our income because we got 5% less sheep to sell, and then it's a percent on the head or a total for the group.
Okay. And then there's a question on, this is an Excel spreadsheet, and it's downloadable from our website, and we can put that link. I think Lisa has that link to share with everybody. She can put that in the chat and you can access it from here, or I can take you back to where you can find it on our website if we're done with this or when we're done with questions.
We had a peripheral question come in, and if this is something that we need to address via email, that's fine. We had a question come in about with the earlier mention of talking about imports from Australia to the US. Is there a source that we know of that's fairly accurate for just finding more information out about, what we're importing, how much we're importing, and some of those things?
I'm sure there's a report at this time. I don't know off the top of my head where that comes from.
I'm guessing we probably have some of that information from like the USDA, like maybe ERS or AMS, one of those would probably have some stuff. So we may need to dig some more on that. If you want to reach out to one of us, we can certainly do some more digging on that question.
Yeah, Carolyn, I don't know if where we're at for time, or if you wanted to show them some of the other
Yeah. sure.
tools that might be helpful to them or not.
Yeah, I'll go back to our topic hub and start from the beginning in case people were not able to join us right away. To get all my driving all these screens. All right. Listen, and Bill, are you seeing the topic hub?
Mhm.
Okay. So this is our livestock topic hub. It's our website where we keep our work, our information, and so I can just drive you around that a little bit now that I'm on the live thing and not a picture. But here is our topics. The small ruminants is located here, and it would also be located here with the small ruminant programs in the program section. And then sometimes some articles will show up here if there's been any written about our cattle and our sheep, things right there. But if we go back to the topics and we find the decision tools and the worksheets, and here are all of the Excel, most of them are Excel spreadsheets, and I'm just going to go to the sheep operation budget. This is the one that we were looking at and that we were presenting during this presentation. And Bill, he highlighted a few other ones that we could use. Also, if you could modify them for your operation. So one is the yardage calculator, but just note that they are going to say the cattle and cows and stuff like that. So the yardage one, and then there is the stocker closeout. So this is what you could use, and you could enter in the information after you sold a group of lambs to see what your actual profitability was.
You want to go back, we can look in the sensitivity table again for the question in the chat.
Did it go to the spreadsheet?
Yeah,
I just want to make sure that it goes where I think it's going.
yeah, so basically those, you can actually change the percent numbers in those blue boxes if you want to, but so here, if we look at the $1.70, that was our break-even cost in this example. And the 56 cents per pound of lamb sold was the feed cost from this example. So it's going to pull those numbers from the example. And then break even says that's our, at the zero is our break even there in the middle. And then if lamb prices go up 5%, but our feed cost stays the same, that means we made 9 cents a pound. It would, so if our break even, wouldn't, now we'd have actually, 9 cents a pound more for the example. So it kind of looks at, okay, how much does things change when prices of either the sale price of the animals or the feed prices change. So and we just typically, when sensitivity analysis is done, 5, 10, 15% changes are sometimes commonly used, but you can change those to, if you think it's going to be a bigger swing potentially that you want to evaluate, you can plug in different numbers across the top and along the sides. So
we did have another question come in the chat. So is there a big difference in the budget if you're using the pasture raised and grass fed, versus if we're doing like the dry lot, what are we expecting a big difference there?
the budgets are very similar, as far as the layout and the format. If we've got time, we can pull them up, and Carolyn and I can kind of show you what some of those are. So, here we see now we've got some pasture expenses in there. And then we've got some additional homegrown and purchase feed costs for supplementing the pasture. And again, however the management is going to dictate what those numbers are that get entered in.
And then I would really suggest not taking these data points or whatever is in information and this as what we're projecting costs and prices to be. This is just an example of what you should put in. So we're really saying that you need to look through this, do the work, put your numbers in, and then see how it works for your operation. Because like I said, this is just an example and it may not be anywhere close to what your outcomes could be. And then here is the finishing cost for the pasture lambs. So sometimes, we will have to feed our lambs some other things besides pasture. If you do, you would enter that grain in these, and if you don't, then you wouldn't have to enter it.
Right. Yeah, and honestly, and Carolyn brings up a good point. We put examples in these to make it easier for people to kind of see how to go through and enter things in, but we intentionally, they're realistic, but they're on the overly conservative, maybe slightly pessimistic side. Because over the years, what we found is if we put things in there that look pretty good, everybody's sure they can do it for that. And that's not what the point of our example was. It was solely an example, and you need to plug your own numbers in there to see how your operation is doing. For some of these enterprises, to be honest with you, we don't have really good benchmark data for them in the upper Midwest. We'd love to have it. And we at different times have investigated trying to get it, but it's been very, very difficult to get. A lot of folks take these home and use them for themselves, but they don't want to share what they have in there, which is understandable. We don't like everybody looking through our stuff. So.
And before
But that's the biggest difference between the two budgets with the dry lot versus the pasture one, is we have the pasture the expense in there. That's the pasture that's being used for the finishing lambs to get some numbers in there for that, which is of course part of the feed costs.
It will continue to take questions, but please take our survey. This is how we know what you really think of the tool, and then how we can help and what other programming we could do for you. So please take our polls.
Okay, not seeing anything new coming through the chat. Everybody must be focused on the poll there.
Very good. And if anybody has questions about how to access the spreadsheet for their own use, just go ahead and contact us. I can put our contact information back up where you can search our website. And then also please join us for our webinar in March for Dr. Justin Luther will present preparations for a successful breeding season.
And if anybody had a question that they wanted to ask verbally, I did just unmute. So if folks want to unmute and ask a question, that option is available now as well.
Hey, can we call Carolyn if we're having problems with this spreadsheet and she can help us out?
Yes, I can do that. But I
Thank
might have
you,
to have
dear.
Bill join us, but sure. Contact us and we can, do a Zoom. I can do a phone call.
Thank you, dear. Appreciate all the work you guys did. Looks like a good product to me.
Oh, great. Well, thank you very much.
Hey, got a quick question about direct marketing of lamb meat products. We direct market to a local, for local farm markets and stuff like that for meat products. Is there a way we could add something like that into this spreadsheet, or is that something I should do myself?
I would actually encourage you to check out the pricing tool that they have at Cornell University for pricing cuts of meat.
And I think there's a tool that Cody Heimke developed a few years ago. I was trying to find it on the sheep industry website tonight, and I could not for the life of me find it. They might have pulled it down for revision, but there's a couple of things out there if you dig long enough. And if I can find that spreadsheet, I will ask Carolyn to send that out as well.
Or send us an email to remind us that you want that link. And I know we covered it a couple of years ago. It's a really nice tool to direct price meat. So
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. And great discussion.
thank you.
Michigan State's has a spreadsheet that has lamb examples. It's not selling the individual cuts. It's selling hanging weight carcass basis to help you look at those costs and pricing. They've got one. Janine, who worked with us on some other ones a few years ago, has one on many species, but it's selling on carcass basis, not cuts of meat. So that's another tool that may or may not fit what you're doing.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if there's a dairy sheep enterprise program or not out there.
I don't know. I would think you could use this to get close. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I'm
how that-
drawing a blank on that one right now too, Bill.
There aren't many sheep dairies into.
Yeah, there's not a lot of industry supports out there on that one anymore.
Yeah, I guess I don't know how difficult it would be to adapt our flock one into a dairy sheep one or not. Obviously, we need a milk sales line in there somehow or another.
Right.
I know a few sheep dairies that we can maybe send it to and work with and see how they would have us adapt it to go that way.
'Cause I think a lot of it's probably already there.
Right.
In our flock, I think a fair amount of it should be there in our flock, but there would be some other things we'd have to figure out how to.
There might need to be a few more lines for,
Right.
I mean, you depends on how, how you want to keep track of all the numbers.
And it might be just as simple to try to find a dairy goat enterprise budget and adapt that. I do know that Iowa State has been doing some dairy goat work and financial dairy goat operation type information is out there. So that might be a good site to look into for some enterprise budget information that you might be able to adapt for similarities.
All right, like that. Thank everybody again for coming, and we are seeing any more questions coming in the chat. Then
Bye, you guys. Have a good evening.
bye. Thank you.